The security camera footage was grainy, but I could see everything clearly. There she was, Margaret from the HOA, climbing over my locked gate at 6 in the morning like some kind of criminal. She had a clipboard in one hand and her phone in the other, taking pictures of my barn, my equipment, my livestock. But then she did something that made my blood run cold. She opened the gate to Thunder's pasture. My 2,000-pound prize bull was grazing peacefully just 50 yards away, and this woman had no idea what she had just walked into. I watched her step inside, still focused on her stupid clipboard, completely oblivious to the danger. Thunder lifted his massive head and stared at her. His nostrils flared. He pawed the ground once, then twice. That is when I realized that Margaret was about to learn why you never, ever trespass on a cattle farm. 6 months ago, I bought 15 acres of pure freedom. After 20 years of city life, HOA meetings and neighbors complaining about my grass being 2 inches too tall, I had finally found my sanctuary. The farmhouse was small but perfect, with a red barn that had stood for 60 years and pastures that stretched to the horizon. Every morning, I would wake up to the sound of roosters crowing instead of traffic. I would walk outside with my coffee and watch the sun rise over my land. My land. Those words still gave me chills. No more HOA presidents knocking on my door. No more fines for parking my truck in my own driveway. No more rules about what color I could paint my fence. I had done my research carefully before buying. The property was 3 miles outside the city limits, well beyond any HOA jurisdiction. I had checked the county records, the deed restrictions, everything. This land was free and clear of any homeowners association nonsense. Thunder was my pride and joy. The massive Angus bull had cost me more than my first car, but he was worth every penny. At 2,000 pounds, he was gentle as a lamb with me, but I knew better than to underestimate him. Bulls are not pets. They are powerful, unpredictable animals that demand respect. I had invested heavily in proper fencing. 6-foot posts driven deep into the ground, heavy-gauge wire, and locked gates at every entrance. Signs reading, "No trespassing" and "Private property" were posted every 50 feet along the road. I had even installed a cattle guard at the main entrance to make it crystal clear that this was working farmland. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October. It was addressed to property owner and bore the official letterhead of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. I almost laughed when I opened it. "Dear property owner," it began, "it has come to our attention that your property may not be in compliance with community standards. We request permission to conduct a property inspection to ensure adherence to HOA regulations." I read it twice, then set it aside. Meadowbrook Hills was the subdivision that had been built 5 years ago, about 2 miles down the road. Their HOA had no authority over my property. I had specifically chosen this farm because it was outside their jurisdiction. That evening, I stood on my porch and watched Thunder grazing in the golden light of sunset. The peace was absolute. No traffic, no arguing neighbors, no committee meetings about whether my mailbox was the right shade of beige. Just me, my animals, and the land I had worked so hard to own. I felt completely secure in my rural fortress. The law was on my side, my property was properly maintained, and my boundaries were clearly marked. I had escaped the HOA world forever. I crumpled up the letter and threw it in the trash. They had no power here. I had no idea that my peaceful world was about to be shattered. The letters kept coming. Every week, sometimes twice a week, another official-looking envelope would appear in my mailbox. Each one was more aggressive than the last. Second notice, property inspection required. Final warning, HOA compliance mandatory. Notice of violation, unauthorized structures detected. I spent hours researching, pulling up county records, property deeds, and HOA formation documents. Everything confirmed what I already knew. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA was formed in 2018. My property was deeded in 1987. They had no authority over me whatsoever. But the harassment was getting worse. I started noticing cars driving slowly past my property. Not just any cars, expensive SUVs with tinted windows that would creep along the road, stop at my gate, and then continue on. The occupants would take photos from the road, writing notes on clipboards. My neighbor Jim stopped by one afternoon with a concerned look on his face. "Hey, I hate to bother you," he said, "but I had someone from the HOA asking questions about your place. They wanted to know if you had permits for your barn renovation." "What barn renovation?" I asked. That is what I told them. You have not touched that barn since you moved in, but they seemed to think you had done major construction without permits. My blood started to boil. These people were not just harassing me anymore. They were spreading lies to my neighbors, trying to create problems where none existed. I decided to try the diplomatic approach. I called the HOA office and spoke to the president, a woman named Patricia who sounded like she had been sucking on lemons. "Ms. Patricia, I am calling about the letters you have been sending to my property. I think there has been a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," she replied coldly. "Your property is in violation of community standards, and we will enforce compliance. But your HOA has no authority over my property. I have the legal documents right here." "That is not what our records show. We will be conducting an inspection whether you cooperate or not." The line went dead. She had hung up on me. That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about her words. Whether you cooperate or not. What did that mean exactly? The next morning, I found fresh tire tracks in the mud near my gate. Someone had been there during the night. My security cameras were still in boxes in the garage, waiting to be installed. I had been putting off the installation because I thought I was safe out here. I was wrong. The final letter arrived on a Friday. It was not a request anymore. It was a demand. Notice of immediate inspection. By authority of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA, an official inspection of your property will be conducted within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in fines of $500 per day and potential legal action. I stared at the letter in disbelief. These people were completely delusional. They had no legal authority, no right to inspect my property, and no power to fine me. But they seemed to believe they could do whatever they wanted. That weekend, I installed security cameras around my entire property. 8 cameras with night vision, motion detection, and cloud storage. If these HOA people wanted to play games, I would be ready. I mounted the cameras on fence posts, barn corners, and the main gate. Each one had a clear view of the approaches to my property. I even installed floodlights that would activate if anyone came near the fence after dark. As I finished installing the last camera, I felt a strange mixture of pride and sadness. I had moved to the country to escape this kind of paranoia, but now I was turning my peaceful farm into a fortress. Thunder wandered over to the fence where I was working. He snorted softly and nuzzled my shoulder, as if he could sense my frustration. I scratched behind his ears and looked out over my land. "Do not worry, big guy," I said. "Nobody is going to bother us here." I was about to find out just how wrong I was. Monday morning started like any other. I was drinking my coffee and checking my phone when I noticed an alert from my security system. Motion detected at 6:15 a.m. That was unusual. The mail carrier did not come until afternoon, and none of my neighbors were early risers. I opened the security app and started scrolling through the footage. What I saw made my coffee mug slip from my hands and shatter on the kitchen floor. There, in black and white video, was a woman in a business suit climbing over my locked gate. She was carrying a clipboard and what looked like a professional camera. The timestamp showed 6:02 a.m. My hands were shaking as I watched her land on my property and dust off her skirt. She looked around nervously, then pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. Of my barn, of my equipment shed, of my truck parked in my own driveway. I recognized her from the HOA meetings I had attended years ago when I lived in the city. Margaret something. She was one of those people who lived for conflict, who got a thrill from wielding whatever small amount of power she could grab. The footage continued. Margaret walked methodically around my property, documenting everything with her camera and making notes on her clipboard. She photographed my chicken coop, my water tank, even my mailbox. She was treating my private property like it was her personal inspection zone. But then she did something that made my blood run cold. She walked toward Thunder's pasture. My prize bull was grazing about 100 yards away, peacefully minding his own business. Margaret approached the fence and started taking pictures of him, apparently trying to document some kind of livestock violation. Thunder noticed her and raised his head. Even through the grainy security footage, I could see his body language change. His ears went forward. His tail started to twitch. These were warning signs that any experienced cattle owner would recognize immediately. Margaret was completely oblivious. She walked along the fence line, still taking pictures, still scribbling notes. Then she stopped at the gate that led into Thunder's pasture. She stood there for a moment, looking at the barn that sat on the far side of the field. My heart started pounding as I realized what she was thinking. She wanted to get closer to the barn to take better pictures, and the fastest way to the barn was straight through the pasture. Through Thunder's pasture. I watched in horror as Margaret unlatched the gate and stepped inside. She left it open behind her, focused entirely on her stupid clipboard and her stupid camera. She had no idea that she had just put herself in mortal danger. Thunder was 200 yards away, but bulls can cover that distance faster than most people can run. And Thunder was not just any bull. He was a breeding bull, 2,000 pounds of muscle and territorial instinct. I could see him through the camera, his massive head turning toward the intruder. His nostrils flared as he caught her scent. He pawed the ground once, then twice. His tail was rigid now, a clear sign of agitation. Margaret was walking deeper into the pasture, completely focused on taking pictures of the barn. She had no idea that behind her, Thunder was making the calculation that every bull makes when they detect a threat in their territory. I jumped up from my chair and ran for the door. My phone was already in my hand, dialing 911 as I sprinted across the yard. But I was 300 yards from the pasture, and Thunder was much, much closer to Margaret. 911, what is your emergency? I have a trespasser in my bull pasture, I gasped, running as fast as I could. She is in immediate danger. I need police and paramedics at 4847 County Road 15. Thunder had started moving, not running yet but walking toward Margaret with that deliberate, purposeful stride that meant business. His head was lowered slightly, his eyes locked on the intruder. Margaret was still taking pictures, still making notes, still completely unaware that she was about to become the target of a very angry, very large bull. I was running full speed now, my lungs burning, knowing I was probably too late. The gate to my own property had never seemed so far away. Behind me, I could hear Thunder's hooves starting to pound the earth. He was no longer walking. He was charging. The sound that came from Thunder's throat was like nothing I had ever heard before. It was part roar, part bellow, pure rage given voice. Even from 300 yards away, it made my blood turn to ice. Margaret finally looked up from her clipboard. She turned around and saw 2,000 pounds of furious bull bearing down on her at full speed. Her scream could have woken the dead. She dropped her clipboard and ran, but she was wearing heels and a tight skirt. Thunder was closing the distance fast. His massive hooves thundered against the earth like a freight train. Dust and chunks of dirt flew up behind him. Margaret stumbled and nearly fell, then kicked off her heels and kept running. She was heading for the fence line, but it was 60 yards away, and Thunder was gaining on her with every stride. I was screaming into my phone as I ran. "She is in the pasture with my bull. Send everyone you have." Thunder was 20 yards behind Margaret when she reached the fence. She grabbed the top rail and tried to climb, but her skirt was too tight. She was trapped. That is when Thunder did something that probably saved her life. Instead of trampling her, he veered away at the last second and started circling. He was not trying to kill her. He was trying to control her, to keep her in his territory until he could figure out what to do with her. Margaret was screaming and crying, clinging to the fence like her life depended on it, which it probably did. Thunder paced back and forth, snorting and pawing the ground. He was confused. His territorial instincts told him to drive away the intruder, but his years of careful breeding and handling had taught him not to attack humans. I finally reached the pasture gate and grabbed a bucket of feed from the barn. Thunder loved his grain, and I was hoping it would distract him long enough for Margaret to escape. "Thunder," I yelled, shaking the bucket. "Come here, boy." The bull's massive head swung toward me. For a moment, I thought he might charge me too. But then he recognized my voice and started walking in my direction. Margaret saw her chance. She scrambled over the fence and fell hard on the other side, landing in a heap in the mud. But she was alive and she was out of the pasture. Thunder trotted over to me, still agitated but responding to the sound of grain rattling in the bucket. I poured the feed into his trough and he started eating, his breathing gradually returning to normal. That is when I heard the sirens. 3 police cars, 2 ambulances, and a fire truck came screaming down my dirt road. The cavalry had arrived, but the battle was already over. I found Margaret sitting in the mud outside the pasture, sobbing and clutching her phone. Her business suit was torn and filthy. She had scratches on her arms and legs from climbing the fence, but she was alive. "Are you hurt?" I asked despite my anger. She looked up at me with pure hatred in her eyes. "I am going to sue you for everything you have. That animal is dangerous. You should not be allowed to keep it." That is when I noticed she was still holding her phone, and it was still recording. "Were you filming this entire time?" I asked. "I was documenting the violations on your property," she said, trying to sound official despite the mud in her hair. "This is evidence of unsafe conditions." I almost laughed. She had illegally trespassed on my property, opened a gate clearly marked Danger Bull Pasture, and nearly gotten herself killed. And she thought she was the victim. The first police officer to reach us was a young deputy named Rodriguez. He looked at Margaret, then at me, then at Thunder peacefully eating his grain. "Can someone explain what happened here?" he asked. This woman trespassed on my property and entered my bull pasture without permission, I said. I have it all on security camera. I was conducting an authorized inspection, Margaret protested. This property is in violation of HOA regulations. Deputy Rodriguez looked confused. Ma'am, this property is outside city limits. No HOA has authority here. That is not what our records show, Margaret insisted. Ma'am, I am going to need to see some identification, the deputy said. And I am going to need to understand why you were on this property without permission. As the paramedics checked Margaret for injuries, I pulled out my phone and showed Deputy Rodriguez the security footage. His expression grew darker as he watched Margaret climb over my gate and walk through my property. She was here for over an hour, I explained, taking pictures, making notes, treating my land like she owned it. And then she opened the gate to your bull pasture. Yes, despite the signs warning about the bull. Deputy Rodriguez shook his head. That is criminal trespassing, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment. Ma'am, you are under arrest. Margaret's face went white. You cannot arrest me. I am an HOA officer. Ma'am, that gives you no legal authority to trespass on private property. As they put Margaret in handcuffs, I noticed she was still clutching her phone, the same phone that had been recording the entire incident, the same phone that now contained evidence of her own crimes. The video went viral within hours. Margaret had been live streaming her inspection to the HOA Facebook page, apparently planning to create a public record of my supposed violations. Instead, she had broadcast her own criminal trespassing to hundreds of viewers who watched in real time as she broke into my property and nearly got trampled by a bull. Someone had screen recorded the entire live stream and posted it to TikTok with the caption, HOA Karen versus Angry Bull. By evening, it had 3 million views. My phone would not stop buzzing. Friend requests, interview requests, messages from strangers sharing their own HOA horror stories. I had accidentally become a folk hero for everyone who had ever been bullied by a homeowners association. The local news picked up the story Tuesday morning. HOA officer arrested after bull chase on private property. The reporter, a serious-looking woman named Amanda Chen, interviewed me on my front porch while thunder grazed peacefully in the background. The property owner says this was the culmination of months of harassment by the Meadowbrook Hills HOA, she reported. Despite clear evidence that his property is outside HOA jurisdiction, he claims they have been conducting unauthorized surveillance and making threats. I showed her the stack of letters, the security footage, and the documentation proving my property was exempt from HOA authority. They acted like they owned my land, I told the camera, like they could do whatever they wanted, legal or not. Margaret, meanwhile, was trying to control the damage. She had posted a statement on the HOA website claiming she was investigating serious safety violations and that my bull was a menace to the community. The problem was, everyone had seen the video. Everyone knew she had trespassed, ignored warning signs, and opened a gate clearly marked danger. Her attempt to play the victim only made her look more ridiculous. Wednesday brought even more consequences. Margaret's employer, a local real estate company, placed her on administrative leave pending an investigation. Apparently, having your agent arrested for criminal trespassing was bad for business. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and issued a statement claiming Margaret had exceeded her authority and acted without board approval. They were throwing her under the bus, trying to distance themselves from the liability. but I had kept every letter, every threat, every demand for illegal inspections. My attorney, David Martinez, was having a field day with the evidence. "This is not just about Margaret," he explained during our meeting. "This is about an organization that systematically harassed you for months, making demands they had no legal right to make. They created a culture where Margaret thought she could break the law with impunity." The criminal case was straightforward. Margaret had been charged with criminal trespassing, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment. The security footage was damning, and her own live stream had recorded her admitting to the trespassing. But the civil case was where things got interesting. We were suing not just Margaret, but the entire HOA board for harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and conspiracy to violate my property rights. "They are going to try to settle," David predicted. "This story has generated too much bad publicity. They cannot afford to let it go to trial." He was right. By Friday, the HOA's attorney was calling, asking to set up a meeting to discuss resolution. The community response was overwhelming. Neighbors I had never met stopped by to offer support. Other HOA victims shared their stories and asked for advice. A local farmers association offered to help with legal fees. Thunder, meanwhile, had become something of a celebrity. Children would come by with their parents to take pictures of the famous bull who chased the HOA lady. He seemed to enjoy the attention, posing majestically by the fence. Margaret's downfall was swift and complete. Her real estate license was suspended pending the outcome of the criminal case. Her employer fired her. The HOA board voted to remove her from all positions. But the damage to the HOA itself was just beginning. Property values in Meadowbrook Hills started dropping as the story spread. Nobody wanted to buy a house in a subdivision run by an organization that had been publicly humiliated for illegal harassment. Current residents were furious. They had paid good money for homes in a well-managed community, only to discover their HOA was run by people who thought they were above the law. A group of homeowners organized a recall petition to remove the entire board. They collected the required signatures in less than a week. The viral video had done more than just embarrass Margaret and the HOA. It had sparked a broader conversation about HOA overreach and the need for accountability. Legal experts were discussing the case on news programs, using it as an example of how homeowners associations could abuse their authority. I found myself at the center of a movement I had never intended to join. But as I watched the sunset over my peaceful farm, with Thunder grazing contentedly in his pasture, I realized that sometimes standing up to bullies creates change that goes far beyond your own situation. The fight was not over yet, but for the first time in months, I felt like I was winning. The emergency HOA board meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the community center. I arrived with my attorney, a box of evidence, and a laptop loaded with security footage. The room was packed with homeowners, reporters, and curious neighbors. The remaining board members sat at the front table looking like they were facing a firing squad. Board President Patricia Williams avoided eye contact as she called the meeting to order. "We are here to address the recent incident involving former board member Margaret Stevens," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "The board wants to make it clear that Ms. Stevens acted without authorization." My attorney stood up. "Mr. Martinez, representing the property owner, we would like to present evidence that contradicts that statement." I opened my laptop and connected it to the room's projector. The first image that appeared was a letter from the HOA dated 3 months earlier, signed by Patricia Williams herself. "This letter, signed by you, Mrs. Williams, demands an inspection of my client's property," David said. "Are you claiming you did not authorize this?" Patricia's face went red. That was a routine compliance request. "For a property outside your jurisdiction. We believe the property was subject to HOA authority." "Based on what evidence?" Silence. David clicked to the next slide. Another letter, this one threatening fines and legal action. Then another demanding immediate inspection access. All signed by board members who were now claiming they knew nothing about Margaret's actions. "Ladies and gentlemen," David addressed the room, "this was not the action of a rogue board member. This was a systematic campaign of harassment authorized and encouraged by this board." The crowd murmured angrily. These homeowners had trusted their board to act legally and responsibly. Instead, they had created a liability nightmare that threatened everyone's property values. Board member Robert Chen tried to defend their actions. "We were just trying to maintain community standards." "By violating the law," David shot back. "By authorizing criminal trespassing." "We did not authorize Margaret to enter the property illegally." "But you authorized her to inspect it, knowing you had no legal right to do so." David played the security footage of Margaret's trespass. The room watched in stunned silence as she climbed over the locked gate, ignored the no trespassing signs, and walked through my property like she owned it. "This is what your community standards enforcement looks like," David said. "A criminal breaking into someone's home." Patricia tried to regain control. "We are prepared to offer a settlement to avoid further legal action." "What kind of settlement?" I asked. "We will pay for any property damage caused by the incident." David laughed. "Property damage? You think this is about a broken fence post?" He clicked to the next slide, showing a detailed breakdown of our legal claims. Harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and punitive damages for the systematic nature of the abuse. "My client is seeking $200,000 in damages," David announced, "plus a formal public apology, the resignation of the current board, and policy changes to prevent future harassment." The room erupted. Homeowners were shouting questions, demanding answers, calling for immediate board resignations. Patricia banged her gavel, trying to restore order. $200,000, she gasped. "We do not have that kind of money." "Then you should have thought about that before authorizing illegal harassment," David replied. Board member Susan Martinez stood up. "I was not involved in any of this. I only joined the board 6 months ago." "But you signed the threatening letters," David said, showing her signature on multiple documents. "You participated in the harassment campaign." "I was just following the lead of the other board members." "Following illegal orders does not absolve you of responsibility." One by one, the board members began to crack. Robert Chen admitted he had concerns about the legal authority, but went along with the majority. Susan Martinez claimed she trusted the board president's judgment without doing her own research. Patricia Williams, realizing she was being abandoned by her own board, finally broke down. "We were trying to protect property values," she sobbed. "That farm brings down the whole neighborhood's value. We thought if we could force him to clean it up." "So you decided to break the law," David said. "You decided that your property values were more important than his legal rights." The homeowners in the audience were furious. They had elected this board to protect their investments, not to create legal liability that could bankrupt the entire association. A homeowner named Jeff stood up. I moved for the immediate resignation of the entire board. Seconded came from multiple voices. Within minutes, 3 of the 5 board members had resigned rather than face personal liability in the lawsuit. The remaining 2 were voted out by emergency election. The new acting board president, a retired lawyer named Michelle Torres, immediately began damage control. "The first order of business is to settle this lawsuit," she announced. "We cannot afford to let this go to trial." She turned to me. "What would it take to resolve this matter?" David handed her our settlement demands. Full payment of damages, a public apology published in the local newspaper, and binding policy changes to prevent future harassment. And Margaret Stevens. Margaret Stevens is facing criminal charges. That is separate from this civil matter. Michelle reviewed the settlement terms. "We will need to call an emergency homeowner meeting to authorize this expenditure." "You have 48 hours, David said. "After that, the settlement offer expires and we proceed to trial." As we packed up our materials, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. The fight was almost over, but the cost had been enormous. Months of stress, thousands in legal fees, and the violation of my peaceful sanctuary. But something good had come out of it. The HOA bullies had been held accountable, and future property owners would be protected from similar harassment. Justice, it turned out, was expensive, but it was worth every penny. The settlement check arrived on a Monday morning, $150,000, along with a formal apology published in the county newspaper. The HOA had also agreed to implement strict policies against harassment and unauthorized property inspections. I stood in my kitchen, holding the check, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and relief. The money would pay for all the legal fees, the security system, and the property damage. But more importantly, it represented accountability for months of harassment and intimidation. Margaret Stevens had pleaded guilty to criminal trespassing and paid a fine of $5,000. She also faced 2 years of probation and 100 hours of community service. Her real estate license was permanently revoked. Her career was over. The old HOA board had been completely replaced. The new leadership immediately implemented reforms, including mandatory legal training for all board members and strict policies against harassment of non-members. Property values in Meadowbrook Hills actually increased once the story died down. Potential buyers saw the reforms as evidence of responsible governance, and the viral video had brought positive attention to the area's rural character. I used part of the settlement money to upgrade my farm's security and improve the facilities for my animals. New fencing, better gates, and a state-of-the-art camera system that would deter any future trespassers. But the best improvement was the new barn I built for Thunder. It was twice the size of the old one, with better ventilation and a comfortable stall where he could shelter during bad weather. He seemed to approve, spending his days grazing peacefully and his evenings relaxing in his new accommodations. Thunder had become something of a local celebrity. Families would drive by on weekends to take pictures of the famous bull who chased the HOA lady. Children would bring apples and carrots to feed him through the fence. He loved the attention, posing majestically for photos and gently taking treats from small hands. The viral video had brought me more than just money and fame. It had connected me with other victims of HOA harassment from across the country. I started getting emails from people sharing their own stories of bureaucratic bullying and legal overreach. Some of these stories were heartbreaking. elderly homeowners forced to spend their life savings fighting frivolous fines, young families driven out of their homes by harassment campaigns, veterans denied the right to fly American flags in their own yards. I began referring these cases to David Martinez and other attorneys who specialized in HOA law. Several major lawsuits were filed based on evidence and strategies developed during my own case. The local Farmers Association asked me to serve on their board of directors. They wanted someone who understood the legal challenges facing rural property owners in areas with expanding suburban development. I accepted the position and began working on legislation to protect agricultural properties from HOA overreach. The bill, nicknamed the Thunder Law by local media, would create strict penalties for organizations that harassed property owners outside their jurisdiction. 6 months after the settlement, I was working in my garden when I heard a familiar voice calling my name. I looked up to see my neighbor Jim walking across the field with a big smile on his face. "You need to see this," he said, holding up his phone. It was a news article about Margaret Stevens. She had been arrested again, this time for trespassing on a different property in the next county. Apparently, she had not learned her lesson and was still trying to conduct unauthorized inspections of properties she had no right to enter. "Some people never learn," Jim laughed. I just shook my head. Margaret had chosen to be a victim of her own arrogance. She could have apologized, learned from her mistakes, and moved on with her life. Instead, she had doubled down on the behavior that destroyed her career and reputation. That evening, I stood on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Thunder was grazing in his pasture, looking peaceful and content. The security cameras were recording everything, but I no longer felt like I was living in a fortress. The harassment had ended. The bullies had been held accountable. My property rights had been vindicated, and new protections were in place for future victims. But most importantly, I had learned something valuable about standing up to institutional bullying. Sometimes the system works, but only if you are willing to fight for what is right. The viral video had made me accidentally famous, but the real victory was much smaller and more personal. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that no one would ever again be able to treat my land like their personal property. It was the peace of mind that came from knowing my rights were protected and my boundaries were respected. It was the simple pleasure of watching my bull graze peacefully in his pasture, safe from trespassers and harassment. Thunder looked up at me and snorted softly, as if he understood that we had both learned something important about defending our territory. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and sometimes when you stand up to bullies, you discover that they are not as powerful as they pretend to be. Justice, it turned out, was sweeter than I had imagined. And Thunder, the unlikely hero of our story, had shown everyone that some boundaries should never be crossed.